Hi! So, I recently had been studying my fundamentals again. To me, personally, animation has been a struggle to learn and understand in general. So, after thinking it over and organizing my thoughts, I decided to make this video to give you and me a little roadmap to know in what order to study and learn the 12 principles of animation in a way that is logical and progressively can help you make sense of each one based on the knowledge of previous, or in other words, it is how I would have went about it if I was starting again. Principle number 1. Solid drawing. I must add a foreword about this one and say that if you want to start animation, you don't need to know how to draw. Because personally, I want to encourage you to experiment and have fun animating if you haven't started. However, while talking about the principles, this one I would say would be my first if I was learning animation again. My number one reason is that if you, for example, want to go pro at some point, directors and producers look at your drawing skills to see if you can adapt to the production, since normally juniors get in-betweener or cleaners jobs. And it gets easier for them to eventually learn animation in the production. Or, that's what happened to me at least. Once again, this is my experience. That aside, the other reasons that aren't work is that solid drawing is the foundation to the rest of the 11 principles, and as such, the better you are at drawing, the better you can animate. As far as I know, solid drawing focus is on just how good you are at drawing form and making it look solid, not stylized. Like this pose from Tanjiro I am referencing here. If we see it this way, what we see is all the work above the structure and the form. Is the style, the design, and all that jumbo that makes things look neat and cool. This, however, is the solid drawing part about it. Here I am just using primitive forms to show the pose from this reference, to make it feel 3D and to make it feel solid. That's what we're looking for, solid, not stylized. Principle number 2. Staging. Right after we understand how to make our drawings look solid, we should consider how to place them in a way that is pleasing to the eye. Let's say you are learning illustration. When you're going under the fundamentals of drawing, you will notice that composition is one of the basics when it comes to making an illustration look good. The same can be said about animation because we as animators want to make it so our actions and movements look good on screen and are readable. So as such, staging to me is something important we should know. Like here, if you see this pose, we can think it's cool and a good pose, but just by being terribly off-center, the shot loses quality and audience readability. But if we consider composition and our staging, we can place him here. Our shot immediately gets better. I say that if you want to improve on this, you should study a bit of storyboard and composition in general, though I will maybe delve deeper on this topic on another occasion. Principle number 3. Pose to pose and straight ahead. Next is personally one of my favorite principles because after learning how to properly stage animations and how to make drawings look solid, in my opinion, this principle would sound better if it had a name like planning or something, but we will leave it as is. Basically, this principle consists of two animation methods, but don't let the name confuse you. They are interchangeable, they can aid each other very well. Pose to pose, for starters, is what you would normally associate with animation work, drawing the keyframes and such. Is a method useful for planning the main movements of your animation, is structural, you can plan choreographies this way and you can give your character acting a bit more flair by using this method. Also, I think this method can help you apply all that solid drawing and actually get better at it, because the poses drawn this way need the solidity of it. However, I can't talk about this method without mentioning its cons, and that is that it can make your animation look stiff and way too methodical, if you're not careful, that is, because it inherently makes you think more about the drawing and the look of it rather than the frame in a set of frames with movement. Next is the straight ahead method. This one is an interesting method for animating because it can be pretty fun to use. It is fluid because you basically animate frame 1, frame second, and such, without a specific plan ahead, making the animation very dynamic. Fast motions, action, smears, effects, they all look good when animated this way, as the animation simply flows, because your way of drawing becomes loose. But just as the pose-to-pose method has its cons, it risks you losing the point of the shot altogether if you're not careful. That, and because you are basically animated the next frame right away, you also risk losing the solidity and consistency of your drawings. After that said, why I love this principle is that you can combine both methods. This I will explain in more detail in another video, but to give you a brief, the idea is to use pose to pose to plan your animation first, and then give it a second pass where you go over your already planned animation and animate loosely what needs to be loose. While pose to pose helps you settle your acting if your character has a tail. Principle number 4: timing and spacing. Overall, this principle right here is the most important one. It's, at least to me, very simple but hard to master, but what really gives your animations life at the end of the day. This section, you'll understand, will be shorter because, as I said, it is very simple to understand. Timing is the time a frame is exposed in an animation, while spacing is the space between each drawing. Mix them up and you get movement that flows together. Very simple. Principle number 5: slow in and slow out. The reason why we must understand timing and spacing first is because of this next principle. If timing and spacing explains to us what animation actually is, slow in and slow out is what tells us where and when that animation moves and how fast and slow. While easing in cushions or movement at the end and goes fast at the beginning, here we will use a timing where our frame exposure is at 2's and our spacing is just like this. Easing out is the contrary. It cushions the beginning and then moves fast at the end. When it gets there is our timing's job, and how fast is our spacing's job. In case our movement requires it, you can mix the two by cushioning both sides. The pendulum effect, basically. Principle number 6: arc. From this principle onwards, and something I didn't understood until now, is that the principles all start to mix together, because in fact, to apply and use arcs, you must first understand slow ins and slow outs, and timing and spacing to use it. To explain arcs simply is that things, but to be more specific, organic things mostly, all move with arcs or creating arcs. For example, look at this guy throwing a ball. See this here? He kinda has to make a circle with his arm to then finally throw the ball. And that happens with practically every movement you want to give life to. However, if you noticed, he is lacking something very important when he throws the ball. And here is where things mix up, because next is principle number 7: anticipation. To explain what our guy here lacks, I first must explain to you anticipation the way a director I had when I first started animating explained it to me. To go left, you must first go right. What does this mean? To explain it, if you had observed movement from plants, people, animals, even cars, yes, I did talk about organic things, but everything works with physics rules. They all share this idea. In real life, it can be subtle if you want to check it for yourself. Like, if you want to jump right this instant, you have to first build up that jump, no matter how small. You must go down first, then go up, and most things work that way. Anticipation is basically that same idea, but the difference is that we as animators focus more on it. So if we look at our guy here again and add an anticipation, this is what he needed to actively charge the throw and for our animation to look liveful, so to speak. Principle number 8: squash and stretch. This one principle I noticed is one of the first ones you see when looking at the 12 principles of animation in a list. But on my list, I will leave it here as number 8, because just as we had already went over timing and spacing, and slow ins and slow outs once more, squash and stretch is the principle that helps us define the reactions to things to those other two principles, and just what is the thing made of, its material. Let me explain. If we have this bouncing ball right here, depending on how much it squashes and stretches, it can show us not only how fast it is going, but also what is it made of. This one, for example, without squashing and such, it looks heavy and by default strong in its material, just like a bowling ball. It's not a real bowling ball, but we can feel its heaviness, like a real one. And we had fixed its timing and spacing so it can bounce back, like a real bowling ball would. You get my point. Just like this, we can tell the ball is soft and moldable if we add this squishy physics, or in other terms, squash and stretch. What you must know before I continue is that when applying this principle, the object's volume does not change. So if this Luffy is stretching his cheeks like this, he has practically the same volume as if he were doing it horizontally. However, still you can exaggerate it. That's why we're moving on to principle number 9, exaggeration. Exaggeration, as you may have already understood, is when we as animators grab a pose and exaggerate it, breaking anatomical and proportional rules of our character. At first, it is a basic concept to understand, but like everything on this list, it can be hard to master. To be honest, I rather use an example to explain this, as it is more of a you see it, you understand it kind of thing. Like this, first Luffy is just how you would draw him normally, but second Luffy is more expressive. Mind you, exaggeration is not something to be overdone, as it is a principle that helps us to give more spice to certain parts of our animation. Principle number 10, follow through and overlapping animation. This one, I believe, rests nicely here as after going through the latest 9 principles on our list, is one we can easily learn to apply. This principle basically is the animation that reacts to another. That another is our center of mass and the initiator of this reaction. To explain this better, remember this Luffy? Here, he stops abruptly on his tracks, and if you notice both his hair, cat ears and cat tail stop way later than him. He is the center of mass. I had marked him with red while everything else that follows through and overlaps is blue. To explain it better, follow through means that when a center of mass has stopped, everything connected to it continues moving after the center of mass has stopped, in this case Luffy, only to return to said center of mass. Just like Luffy's cat features continue moving and then return to where he is. While overlapping action refers to parts moving at different times. Like once again, Luffy stops, his hair returns second, his cat ears stop next at a different timing, and his tail is the last to return to a main position. I must add as an extra note that there is this thing called overshoot in animation in which this idea applies, but that is something I want to explore more on a video about timing and spacing specifically. Principle number 11, secondary action. I must admit to you that I confused secondary action and follow through slash overlapping action for a very long time. I don't know why it happens, but I think it's because you are inclined to believe that said secondary action refers to the things that follow through, or at least that's what confused me about it. However, after too much stress thinking about it, I finally realized that secondary action, the principle, refers to the acting part of an animation. Let me explain. You see this guy? He's turning his head and part of his body to look at us. This is the primary action. What is the primary action? Basically, what the main action is. Like in this case, I just want a guy turning to look at the camera. This is the main action. As such, secondary action is how he goes about turning his head towards the camera. He can maybe turn confident towards us, Or maybe he can look at us with fear or worry. That is secondary action. It's quite literally the acting and how a specific character goes about doing an action, depending on the context of our shot and who our character is. Finally, the last principle on every list for a reason. Number 12. Appeal. I had seen a ton of videos, read books, and asked online many times about a clear explanation of this principle and how it applies to animation. However, I must admit that it took me a while to get not only my own conclusion, but to mix what other people knew about it together to understand this one. What people understand by appeal, commonly that is most centered towards characters and how they look and act. Their appeal can come perfectly from being the typical princess archetype, but it can also perfectly define a monster who looks and plays the role greatly without having to look attractive, so to say. But to add to this, I personally think that appeal is not only subjective, because we'll connect to and like different characters, but it is also in animation is the result of actually managing to mix all of the 11 principles. To me, it represents that stage where you are comfortable combining everything mentioned to get said appeal, because then you would have gotten your character properly alive, acting, living, and looking overall very good. It also helps to have a good character design, but I want to specify that for animation, that is what gets us the appeal, in my opinion. It's mastery. Now you have my own personal list in what order to learn the principles of animation. I hope this list and explanation can be useful to you in any way, as I wanted to make something that would be useful for past me when I was just starting out and utterly confused as to where to start, and maybe it can help someone who is in the same situation as I was. In general, you are free to explore in which ways you feel more comfortable studying the principles and in which order. But if this helps you as a guide to know what things are, that's great.